Spoilers may be about the place. In 1981, horror audiences would see the demise of Michael Myers in Halloween 2, when, alongside Dr. Loomis, he was blown sky high at the end of that film. In the eyes of series creators John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, this was the true ending to Michael Myers' story, and they wanted further sequels to have more of an anthology style of storytelling, centered around Halloween night, with each sequel having its own characters and setting to tell a unique story. A very interesting premise to say the least, but sadly horror fans weren't ready for this type of idea, and when the first of these films came out, it was soundly rejected at the time of its release. People wanted Michael Myers, and when they didn't get him, they were clearly upset. But is Halloween 3 Season of the Witch really that bad, or is it an interesting horror film in its own right? Well, let's light some jack-o'-lanterns, put on our Halloween masks, and stuff some sweets into ourselves as we find out how good Halloween 3 Season of the Witch truly is.
Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, the night no one comes home.
Our movie film begins on Saturday the 23rd of October, where some lad is feckin' legging it away from something. But he is stupid enough to stop and have a gawk at the very slow moving car that is chasing him. The lad does try to hide from the car, but then ends up bumping into this sharply dressed fiend, who then tries to feckin' murder him. But then that lad ends up getting crushed by a damn car. And after making a sandwich of that guy, the other lad just legs it off into the night. A bit later, we learn that someone has gone and robbed feckin' Stonehenge. Now, what sort of devil would go and do that? We hear for the first time in this film the most annoying jingle ever put to cinema.
Halloween, Halloween, in 4 days to Halloween, silver shamrock.
Seriously, that thing will wreck your head. Anyway, it's a commercial advertising new fancy Halloween masks that every kid is gonna want that year. And this poor lad who was just having himself a quiet night working at the gas station and watching a spot of telly gets the bejesus scared out of him by our mystery lad, who then passes out while telling him everyone is coming.
They're coming.
We meet our lead, Dr. Dan Callis, played by the always epic Tom Atkins. He's trying to score some brownie points with his children by buying them masks, but they already have a pair of silver shamrock ones we seen earlier. Dan's a doctor at the local hospital and ends up getting a page to come in for an emergency. And wouldn't you know it, he ends up treating our mystery man from earlier, who freaks out when he hears the feckin' jingle.
They're going to kill us. All of us.
Anyway, later that night, that lad ends up dushed when one of these dodgy suit lads sticks his feckin' fingers into his eyes. That is such a horrible way to go. A nurse finds him and Danny Boy comes a-running, and she does her best to explain what happened.
A man just...
Why would Dan just run after him for that? He didn't even see what he did. Well, the suit lad just sits in his car and then pours petrol all over himself and then blows himself the fuck up. Yet everyone acts like it's a totally normal thing to have just seen. Why is no one reacting strongly to this at all? I'd be like, what the fuck is going on? The next day, the daughter of our mystery man arrives at the hospital to confirm that it's his dushed body. I mean, I'm pretty sure we know he's dead. Dan is wondering what the hell is going on, so he goes to the coroner for answers.
I know the sheriff thinks he was on drugs.
That doesn't make any sense. I've seen lots of people on drugs. The man was in complete control. He looked like a businessman.
I mean, 90% of businessmen are on coke and other stuff. They're probably all roided out of it. Dan asks her to keep investigating the lad's body for him to see if she can discover anything else about it. But 'tis Friday the 29th now, and Dan is hitting up the pub when Ellie, the daughter of the dead lad, shows up to the bar to talk to him. She's looking to see if her dad told Dan anything before he got his eyes poked out. Dan tells her that her father said someone was going to kill them all. So that, and Ellie being a pretty hot woman, is enough for Dan to trade in his doctor's coat for a detective's hat as himself and Ellie begin to investigate the crime. They discover that her father went off to the place the silver shamrock masks come from, so they decide to head off to investigate further. They head off to Santa Mira, which is an old Irish founded town famous for its Halloween masks. And just like any small Irish town, the locals are nosy as fuck, thinking, who's this big city lad now coming to town? Dan and Ellie decide to lay low for a bit and rent a motel room from the most diddly-eyed Irish lad ever.
It's cozy, it's quiet, and the price is right.
Oh dear God, that is awful. Anyway, while this leprechaun is helping Ellie with her bags, Dan goes into the motel reception and finds out that Ellie's father stayed there before. But as he's coming back, he nearly gets killed by the salesman and then nearly gets hit by this Bure. Jesus, no one can drive around here at all. Dan tells Ellie about her father and decides that they need to lay low until nightfall. So we all know where this is leading to. Dan getting the shift. That seriously came out of nowhere, and he's like 30 years older than her. Fair play to the man. Later that night, Dan meets a random drunk who tells him some backstory about the town.
Hey, Cochran, fuck you!
Well, that lad's dushed for sure. He tells Dan he's going to burn the mask factory down to the ground, as that's a totally normal thing for someone to do. And what ends up happening to this drunk lad? Well, he gets his head ripped right off him by the suit lads. That's what he gets for talking shite. Back at the motel, Ellie talks to this random woman called Marge, who is here to collect masks for her shop, but she isn't happy with the factory at all. After bitching and complaining for a while, Marge settles in for the night with her book, but starts messing with one of the mask's disc labels and ends up getting her face blasted right off. And speaking of blasting off, in the room beside them, Danny Boy is getting himself some. It has to be the tash that does it for women. Later that night, a bunch of lads show up to take Marge's body away, and Ellie and Dan are like, what the hell is going on? But then, the feckin' old man from RoboCop shows up. This is Mr. Cochran, played by actual Irish actor Dan O'Hurley, and he's so charming that he just tells Dan and Ellie, sure, your one will be totally fine, not to worry, although Dan is still suspicious of him. The next day, Dan rings Teddy, and she's confused as hell as to why there is no human remains from the car. Dan asks her to find out as much as she can about Cochran, but unknown to him, someone is listening in on his phone call. Dan and Ellie go to Silver Shamrock to investigate her father's order, and run into the salesman from earlier, Buddy, and his family, who are there to meet Cochran, who ends up giving them all a tour of the factory. Dan starts to see some strange lads and other odd things going on at the factory, and that's before Ellie spots her father's car. So clearly these lads are up to no good. Dan and Ellie decide to get the hell out of there, but of course Ellie gets kidnapped somehow.
Ellie! Ellie!
And the bad lads show up. Dan manages to get away from them and sneaks back into the factory, where he ends up fighting one of these weird feckin' lads who totally no-sells punches. Come on, you'll never get over doing stuff like that. Dan does manage to summon all of his mustache power and punches a hole into the lad and discovers he's a feckin' robot. Which leaves Dan totally dazed and confused, and then Cochran shows up with two more robo lads, and they take Dan hostage. The next day, and it is Halloween, and Cochran decides to reveal his evil plan to Dan without even being asked. And wouldn't you know it, feckin' Cochran stole some of Stonehenge. How the hell did he get that shipped all the way stateside?
We had a time getting it here. You wouldn't believe how we did it.
All right then, keep your secrets.
Well, it turns out Stonehenge is made up of feckin' magic dust that can do all sorts of things, and Cochran's been building them into his masks. But he's got another surprise for Dan, as he's about to show Dan a demonstration of its power. Remember that annoying family from earlier? Well, Cochran causes their son to have feckin' bugs and snakes and all other sorts of gack stuff come out of his body. That is a fucking nasty way to kill someone. It turns out there's a special thing within the mask's label that is triggered by this feckin' commercial and its jingle. With their son Wormfood, the boy's parents also end up #dushed. This is pure daft, and this film has balls for killing a kid like that. But it's only going to get worse, as kids all across America are wearing their masks, getting ready to watch the big show at 9 p.m, not knowing they too will have their heads burst wide open. That night, Teddy ends up being paid a visit by one of Cochran's robo-lads, and just after she had figured out the lad who blew himself up wasn't human. Sadly, the robo-lad feckin' drills right into her skull, making her #dushed. Back over in Santa Mira, Dan is tied up by Cochran and wants to know his evil motivations. And Cochran gives Dan a history lesson all about Irish Halloween.
It was the start of the year in our old Celtic lands, and we'd be waiting in our houses of wattles and clay. The barriers would be down, you see, between the real and the unreal. And the dead might be looking in to sit by our fires of turf. Halloween. The festival of Samhain. The last great one took place 3,000 years ago, and the hills ran red.
Yes, we Irish are all drunks and witches. Also, lads, I'm going to pause this here and just say how great it is to actually hear someone pronounce Samhain right. None of this Sam Hain bollocks like we had in Halloween 2. Anyway, Cochran has put one of his masks on Dan's head and has left him to sit and watch TV, so he ends up worm food when the broadcast happens. But Dan the man manages to get free and even escapes the room through the vents. He ends up finding Ellie and freeing her, but Cochran sends his robo-lads after them. But the two of them leg it away and end up sneaking around the control center, and Dan manages to sneak to the main control unit and switches the machine on, and then throws a ton of the killer discs at the lads, which fries everything and everyone in the feckin' place. Well, everyone but Cochran, who was well impressed with Dan's resourcefulness. But the bit of Stonehenge he stole takes him out, making him #dushed. Dan and Ellie get the hell out of town as quick as they can, but feckin' Ellie attacks Dan out of nowhere and they crash the feckin' car. And Jesus Christ, wouldn't you know it, Ellie has been turned into a feckin' robot. And Dan busts the head off her. Dan legs it away and makes it to the local petrol station, where he rings the networks, demanding to turn the broadcast off, which they begin to do one by one. But one station isn't playing ball and won't listen.
Stop it!
And with that, the movie film is dushed. Now, this is one of the Halloween films in the series that people either seem to love or hate. The film really had an uphill battle right from the start with the fan base, with Michael Myers not being in the film. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, let's get into the good of this film. Season of the Witch is an interesting take on a horror film. It's pretty creative and totally daft. I mean, you have robot lads going around murdering people, Stonehenge being used in witchcraft, a random doctor investigating it all, masks that straight up murder kids, and all other sorts of random stuff. Also, it has such a great ending where the good guys lose and leaves you on such a downer and leaves you thinking, what the fuck just happened? I can remember watching this one Saturday night when I was a teenager, thinking I'm about to see Michael Myers kill a bunch of people, and instead I got this mental idea. And you know what? It had me gripped throughout. It isn't your generic slasher film, which really makes the film interesting. I mean, come on, this film feckin' kills kids for God's sake. That is ballsy as hell. You barely ever see that, and even as a teenager, I remember thinking, this is grim as fuck. It's a really well shot film that gives you a great Halloween vibe. I think even more so than most of the other Halloween films, besides maybe the opening of Halloween 4. Actually having the story centered all around Halloween and its traditions is great. The cinematography in the film helps give it a true sense of dread and foreboding. It really stands out when put up against the later sequels. I'm also a fan of some of the actors in this film. Tom Atkins, who is a staple of 80s horror films, is great in this and gives a great performance, especially at the end when he's demanding for the commercial to be turned off. But he is easily outshined by Dan O'Hurley as Cochran. He is such a great villain in this, mostly because he doesn't come across as one for most of the film. And when the turn comes and he gives this great speech about Samhain, you're like, fuck yeah, this lad is evil as fuck. Also, some of the kills in this are great. They're all kind of fucked, but not on an overly gory way, more in a sense that it would be horrible to have done to you, like a drill to the head or the eye poke. No thanks, don't want that. The score here once again is great, but that's a given when it's John Carpenter doing a score for a horror film. He always knows how to enhance a film with his music. So with all that being said, let's move on to the bad. I know it's the easiest thing to say as a negative for this film, but I guess it has to be said that you can knock it for having Halloween in its title. I think films like Friday the 13th and other slasher films with sequels condition people into believing the slasher villain would always be in them. It's not a big negative for me, but yes, it has to be said that people will find it annoying. And while I enjoy the mental story this film goes for, I just have to say that it's feckin' weird that Dan just decides he wants to go and investigate this whole thing even though he is a doctor. I guess it's just because he wants to bang Ellie. It all kind of adds to the daftness of this film that it's a doctor running around trying to solve it all, but it just makes no sense at all. And I'm not the biggest fan of Ellie as a character. She's kind of wooden in the film and not given much to do besides being another woman in a film that falls for Tom Atkins' charms. Seriously, that lad got around in the 80s. It's also strange at the end of the film that she is a robot, but for some reason doesn't try to stop him when he's killing all the other robots and Cochran. You'd think she would have acted then instead of waiting to strike in the car. And while it's great to say Dan O'Hurley being all charming as hell, I have to knock the rest of that town's cast for being overly diddly-eye with their accents, especially the motel owner. He just sounds like he's dialed up to 11 on what people think Irish people sound like, and it's always so cringe to me. Also, the damn jingle is so head-wrecking. Even the first time I seen it, I was like, oh my god, would this thing stop playing all the time? It's a horrible earworm that just drives you mad. But I guess that is what it was designed to be. It's a shame that more people haven't seen this film. I think if it had been just titled Season of the Witch, it would be seen in a much more positive light by all horror fans. But I think even if you are a diehard Halloween fan, that you should still check this film out. Just leave Michael Myers burnt to a crisp in part 2 for now, and take it as its own film, and you will get a lot of enjoyment out of this crazy wild ride. So I give Halloween 3 Season of the Witch 3.5 out of 5 horses. So what do you think of Halloween 3? Do you absolutely hate it due to Michael Myers not being about the place? Or do you enjoy it for all the madness it brings to the screen? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you next time when we horse into another movie film.